Everybody, and welcome to our Kogod Connections October webinar. My name is Aman Omar, and I'm the Associate Dean for Graduate Programs at Kogod, and it's my pleasure to kick off the program for you today. We've got two special guests with us, Brett Leatherman, who's the FBI Assistant Special Agent in Charge and Cybersecurity Investigator, as well as our own Professor Heng, who's the Director of our Kogod Cybersecurity and Governance Center. Joining our guest is Dean John Delaney, Dean of the Kogod School of Business. Before I turn it over to Dean Delaney, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. Dean Delaney will have a discussion with our guests and for around 35 or 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Please feel free to type in your questions in the chat box, and we'll get through as many questions as we can. This webinar will be recorded for archival and educational related and promotional purposes. So hope you enjoy the program for today. Without further ado, Dean Delaney, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Ayman. I appreciate the introduction very much. And I'm delighted to be here with our two special guests. We've heard from faculty, staff, students, and alumni that the subject of ransomware is very interesting to them. And this webinar is intended to provide some information on it. We're going to be joined by two experts, as Ayman has mentioned. Dr. Heng is a professor of information technology and analytics at the Kogod School. She also serves as the director of the Kogod Cyber Governance Center. Before joining Kogod in 2018, she served as a faculty member at Penn State for 12 years, and she also served as a program director at the National Science Foundation for 3 years. She's served on a broad spectrum of national leadership committees, including co-chairing the Federal Privacy R&D Interagency Working Group in 2016 and serving on the National Academy's Committee on Open Science in 2017 and 2018. Heng's recent research focuses on AI governance, privacy protection, data ethics, and algorithmic fairness. Her scholarly work has been published in premier outlets across various fields such as psychology, business, computer science, and law. Her interdisciplinary research and education have been sponsored by many competitive grants from multiple funding agencies such as DARPA, the NIH, NSF, and the National Security Agency. Her work has received many awards, including Woman of Achievement Award in the IEEE Big Data Security, that was in 2021, IEEE ITSS Leadership Award in Intelligence and Security Informatics in 2020, the Operational Research Society's Stafford Beer Medal in 2018, and the National Science Foundation's Career Award in 2010. Heng, we're just delighted that you're a member of the faculty and that you're willing to spend time on this topic with us today. Heng is going to be joined by Brett Leatherman. As Ayman mentioned, Mr. Leatherman is Assistant Special Agent in Charge for National Security in FBI Dallas. He manages teams responsible for investigating counterterrorism, counterintelligence, weapons of mass destruction, and cyber threats. Prior to this role, he was Supervisory Special Agent of the Dallas FBI Office National Security Cyber Squad, which was charged with imposing risk and consequence on global cyber adversaries. He also has held several leadership roles in the FBI Cyber Division in Washington, D.C., working as a supervisory special agent in a cyber national security unit and as assistant section chief of the cyber operational engagement section, managing FBI initiatives to collaborate with domestic and foreign partners to protect U.S. interests. Throughout his career, he's worked extensively with the U.S. intelligence community. He entered duty as a special agent with the FBI in 2003 Prior to his assignment in FBI headquarters, he served in the Cleveland and Detroit field offices as a special agent, working complex criminal investigations while also serving as an FBI pilot and hostage negotiator. Mr. Leatherman graduated from Cornerstone University with an undergraduate degree in computer information systems and is a graduate student at Georgetown University studying cybersecurity risk management. He holds many widely recognized cyber certifications and is a regular FBI speaker on emerging cyber threats. Thank you so much, Brett, for being here. We're delighted that you're going to be joining Heng and me and Ayman for this webinar today. Because people are so interested, I'd like to jump right into this. And I'm going to start with a question to Heng. Would you be willing to start us off by explaining to the audience what ransomware is, how long it's been around, and what it tends to do?
Sure, I'd be happy to just start with the definition since I'm a professor here. Hopefully I give you some, interesting beginning of the definitions and so on. So ransomware is actually not something novel, in the 21st century. It has been a type of malicious software that has been, existing for a while. And ransomware often threatens to publish your confidential data or blocks access to your data or systems until the victim pays a ransom fee to the attacker. And a ransomware attack can start with something like a simple malicious link or an email attachment, or in the format of virus or worm that infected on your computers and so on. And after ransomware malware is installed on the victim's machine, the malware often spreads to other devices on the network and connects to the external server that is often controlled by the attacker. So talking about the history of ransomware, broadly speaking, such blackmailing computer users is not something new, and we just see in the year of the 2020. In fact, as early as 1989, the first ever ransom attack went after AIDS researchers back then, and it was distributed on floppy disks. And that malicious software was embedded in a computer-based questionnaire. And that so-called questionnaire was actually designed to be used by AIDS researchers to help determine patients' risk of contracting AIDS. And 20,000 of these floppy disks under the name of a computer-based questionnaire and sent to or distribute to the researchers in 90 countries. And when participating scientists loaded the disk on their computer, their computers became infected. And the virus scrambled the contents of the victims' computers and offered to unlock them only in return for a license fee. And think about that. Now, almost 30 years later, in the year of 2020, we're not seeing this form of ransomware gone. Instead, we're seeing the ransomware attacks are on the rise with the pandemic in the year of the 2020. And I guess that's the reason why we're so interested in exploring this topic today. So back to you, Dean Delaney.
Thank you, Heng, for the introduction. And I want to go to Brett right now. This stuff sounds like it stinks pretty bad. And we've heard recently there have been some high-profile cases that I suspect the FBI was involved in. And I wonder if you could explain a little bit. I think they talk about a SolarWinds case and attack, what happened there and how that might have affected this Colonial Pipeline case where many of us here in Washington had to wait in line for gasoline. We hadn't done that since the 70s. Could you give us some background on that and provide any guidance on sort of what happened and whether there are things that could have been done differently that would have made this either go away or would protect us in the future?
Yeah, thank you. And first, thanks to American University for hosting this. Thank you for the invite. We always, our mission is within the FBI is to impose risk and consequence on criminal and nation state and national security based cyber actors. Part of that increasingly is engaging private sector academia on the threat. We all have to partner on this. So thank you for the invite. The 2020 to 2021 has seen a significant rise in ransomware events. FBI, the FBI has cyber squads or cyber task forces in all 56 field offices. So it allows us to have a forward deployed workforce so that when Colonial Pipeline, Kaseya, JBS, when these major breaches happen, we have boots on the ground from a law enforcement and an intelligence community perspective who can respond to provide assistance to victims where we can, and also to really fulfill our mission of attribution, investigation, attribution, and pursuit of the adversary. You mentioned SolarWinds. SolarWinds, while not specifically a ransomware attack, it shows kind of the propensity of these adversaries to use software-based supply chain attacks to inflict maximum consequence to victims in the US through those kind of attacks. Kaseya was similar in that it was a supply chain based ransomware attack where the adversary can look for one company, one organization who has a technical footprint in hundreds or thousands of other organizations. And by attacking that one organization, it has a cascading effect on US based and global companies. So we have seen this move from one-off targeting, which we still see, to more of a supply chain or a third-party risk approach where you can attack companies associated with larger companies in order to get into their networks, leveraging principles of trust, really. And so you also touched on another fact, which was you waited in line for gas is a result of a cyber attack. And we have seen real world, more kinetic type consequences as a result of these cyber attacks. Cyber attacks, whether it's Colonial Pipeline or shortages in meat supply related to the attack of JBS, whether it's a cyber attack on the Ukraine power grid, which resulted over, a few years back, over very cold winter months, power going out to tens of thousands of Ukrainian-based residents, or even last year, a ransomware attack on a German hospital that resulted in the death of a patient who was in going under a cardiac event. So these do have real world consequences now. And the concern, obviously, for the FBI and the US intelligence community, for the White House, for the Department of Justice is how do we continue to build resiliency against these attacks? Because if criminal actors are engaging in these kind of acts which cause these kind of consequences, real world physical consequences, what happens when the nation states start being less judicious or less responsible, if I can use that term, with their cyber exploitation, and they start to attack critical infrastructure as well? That's a big concern for us.
Let me do just one quick follow-up, Brett, because I understand that we've got these issues with big companies and government and big universities, but what if I'm just an individual or I'm a small business owner? Aren't those bad actors going to focus on the big targets and leave me alone? Is this something that really is just for the news, but I can just relax?
So I call that the principle of security through obscurity, and that is no way to operate in today's environment. Now, it is true that the large companies command the large headlines. When they're attacked, when they're breached, there are so many folks who are impacted by it that it causes a lot of headlines. I would tell you this, that most of the events that the FBI responds to, we respond to all those major events that you see in the headlines, but the majority of events that the FBI responds to and is aware of are happening among small to medium businesses. Those don't get the kind of headlines that critical infrastructure gets. And the thought process, if I'm the only employee in my organization, or maybe I have an organization with 10, 20, 50 people, why are these guys sitting in Russia, sitting in China, or elsewhere going to target me? And what I would say is, if you hold data that's important to you or important to anybody else, that has value. Your business has value, and the adversary knows that. Especially the cyber criminal enterprises know the smaller companies have less security in place than even the larger companies. And so it's a lot easier to target a smaller company. You're going to get less money, but you're going to hit a lot more and be successful in a lot more cases. The other piece I would say to that is this: they aren't going to necessarily target you by name, your organization by name. But in today's technical environment, they can scrape the IP space, they can scrape the internet, they can scan networks, public IPs, and all they have to do is find a vulnerability. It's an automated process. It requires very little manpower. And as soon as they get an alert that they've identified a vulnerable IP, it could be a Fortune 100 company, or it could be a company of one sitting here in Dallas, Texas. They're going to target that organization because they see a known vulnerability that they can exploit. So they're not going to target you by name. They're going to find you as a result of what your current posture is in a very automated way.
This is pretty scary, and I want to turn to Heng right now, because as a privacy researcher, that I probably don't keep enough of my information private. We all have information that's out there on the web. So if someone can come after any of us, what are the first things that we should do if we get a sense that we've been compromised by one of these attacks?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think it's true. I agree with Brett that, I think there's an old saying that every company or every one of us will be, hacked. Our data will be hacked. Our system might be compromised. The question is just when. So in terms of, defend yourself against these attacks, or once you realize that your systems or your data are compromised, first, I think I would suggest that if you are lack of experience, then get someone, with more experience, such as Brett, the FBI and law enforcement, consult them, talk to them, because they have been seeing so many cases. They are more experienced than any of the business, because business are actually dealing with the single case on the basis. And then after that, you could think about doing what we call response and recovery from the business perspective. First, you probably want to determine which kind of your assets in terms of systems, IT infrastructure, networks, as well as your data, determine which of these assets were impacted. And once you identify these leakage points or compromised, points, you will try your best to immediately isolate them. As I mentioned in the beginning, that the attackers can spread these viruses, right, in these ransom attacks through the networks. So first, you identify compromised points and isolate them. In the event, just the worst case scenario, if you are not able to disconnect these compromised devices from your network, well, you always have the off button, right? Power them down to avoid further spread of the ransomware infection. But that's the worst case scenario, because if you completely switch off everything, that will definitely interrupt your business, interrupt the whole infrastructure. And once you are doing this, try to isolate these attacks, identify the vulnerable points, and disconnect and isolate these compromised points. And then you try to identify and prioritize the critical systems, determine which are the most important things in your business model for recovery. Okay, have that priority list. Is that the data? Is this infrastructure that you need to have your business back, up for, within minutes, or within hours, or within days? Go back to your initial response and recovery plan, and try to have that priority in terms of having parts of the business and all the data back up. And then meanwhile, also remember always to document your understanding, document every single cost benefit analysis you have been done. And remember that this is not a one-time effort. Might be an ongoing process in terms of recovery. Always document everything. Always try to have this more information, right? More information being accumulated about the damages and the whole investigation process of ransomware. So that's the initial steps I have been thinking about. These should be the steps that documented in any response and recovery plan for any business as part of the routinary risk management assessment plan.
Thanks, Heng. And I want to follow up just with a quick question that when we had a preliminary conversation, I was surprised and became worried because I asked you, what's the likelihood this is going to happen? And you said, everybody's got to expect it. Now, is that true? Do we all have to expect that this is going to happen, that there's no super secret way for us to keep Invincible out there? Or is this the future we're going to be dealing with?
I think, yes, that's the case, unfortunately. And people, I think Brett will agree with this, right? There is no 100% security. Nothing is secure by guarantee or by default, no matter how good you are in terms of your defense systems. There are attackers and hackers can always find the vulnerabilities. Nothing is really secure. And John, you also mentioned about privacy. As a privacy researcher, I would also say there is no 100% guarantee of privacy or no 100% guarantee of data confidentiality. Database can have the vulnerable points that can lead to data breach, and even anonymized data can be re-identified because of today's data integration techniques, data analytics, data mining, big data. So there is no, even you anonymize your data, these anonymized data can be re-identified. So nothing guaranteed. I'm sorry to say this.
Thank you, Heng. I guess everybody needs to go and get some sort of cybersecurity degree to protect themselves. I want to switch over to Brett for a minute, though, that, since it seems many people will fall victim to some sort of attack, sort of a two-phase question. One is, if you get hacked and are falling victim to a ransomware attack, does this mean that your data are compromised and your data are gone? Or is this a situation where they're just locked up and the bad guy doesn't have them? And then the bad guys always say, don't call the police. We see that on TV all the time, right? If they tell me, if anyone else is involved, we are really going to put the screws to you, should I contact the FBI anyway? What's the best approach for me to take if I do get attacked?
Yeah, so to answer your last question first, report the compromise is what we say. Report the compromise to the FBI. It does a couple things. It allows us to work with your third-party incident response company or your internal teams to bring subject matter expertise to bear against the adversary. We do incident response 365 days a year, and it costs you, well, I wasn't gonna say nothing because you don't pay for our incident response, but it costs you your tax dollars, right? Your business taxes. So you pay for us indirectly anyway. So call us. We have cyber agents assigned to embassies globally. So this is a global threat. Most of these ransomware groups are coming from outside the United States, and they're also compromising networks in Europe and elsewhere. So we work regularly with our international partners. We work both in the criminal and the national security space, which gives us an optic that no incident response firm is going to bring to the table. So call the FBI. We can't always help, but we can provide advice and recommendations. And actually, it's not our primary mission to do remediation work, right? That's part of what DHS helps to do with critical infrastructure. But the government doesn't really do remediation work. Private sector leverages private sector agencies to do that. We just bring in expertise because we see it all the time. There are occasions where we see specific malware variants that we can say, listen, this is where you want to look. This is where you want to spend some of your time, and that advice can help save money. So always report the breach from our perspective. And we will work closely with your third-party incident response team in doing that. So that was kind of the second question. Can you repeat kind of your first question?
Well, I'll just rephrase it. Should I pay the ransom? Is there any way I can get my data back without paying the ransom? And if I pay the ransom, is that just encouraging more of this? What approach should I take?
Yeah, so the environment we are in today, and this is Brett Leatherman's opinion, this does not necessarily represent the opinion of the FBI, but the reason we are in the environment we're in is because ransoms are being paid. Listen, if ransom payments were not being paid, it would not be a lucrative environment for the criminal enterprises that are currently attacking us. In 2015 and 2016, we did not see the number of breaches that we see today. We also did not see the exorbitant ransom amounts that are being demanded today by the adversary. But it was the emotional response that kind of happened through the attack of municipality networks that were not well defended. 2015 and 2016 saw attacks on hospitals. It was emotional. Patient records were encrypted, and they wanted to get them back as quickly as possible. They wanted to be able to admit patients. They wanted to understand what treatments patients were undergoing. You know, in some cases, they didn't know what medication they had given a patient the day prior because the records were encrypted. So hospitals paid on a regular basis. Businesses have paid since that time, and that's a reason we're in the environment today. Our recommendation is don't pay the ransom. Number one, you're not guaranteed to get your data back. Number two, if you do get your data back, you don't always know how they got in the first place. Most companies will pay the ransom, they'll get their data back. They won't do root cause analysis. The adversary will come back, whether the same group or a different group, a month or two later and re-compromise the organization. They'll have to end up paying again. So it also goes towards funding criminal enterprises. You are giving US-based money to a criminal enterprise. What's worse is if terrorist organizations start to see what is happening here, and if a hospital in the United States is encrypted with ransomware launched by Al-Qaeda or ISIS or another foreign terrorist organization, they pay that organization $1 million, $50,000, $500,000 to get their data back. And that money is used to send a suicide bomber or another attack against that same hospital in the United States. So you could be funding terrorism. I would also say that folks who are considering paying a ransom should understand the OFAC, the Treasury sanctions related to paying a ransom. December of 2020, Treasury released OFAC guidance on being held potentially liable for paying a ransom. So we understand that in many cases, it's a business decision. If you can't get your data back and your business may go under, folks are going to make the decision to pay a ransom payment. You just have to understand the risks associated with doing that before you do it. Our preference is that you take steps now, concrete steps now, to mitigate the harm that may happen, the fallout that may happen related to a ransomware attack. And there are technical ways, there are business process ways to do that, and to be able to reconstitute on your own after a ransomware attack. You also asked the question, is my data violated? Is my data out there, right? And we have seen a movement by these groups to first get into your network, exfiltrate data, then encrypt the data, demand that you pay a ransom to get your data back, and then put further pressure on you by saying, we're going to release some of your most sensitive emails and documents publicly if you don't pay a ransom quickly. And so I think in almost every incident, we're not regulators, but we're law enforcement, but in almost every incident, if you suffer a ransomware breach, you should consider the fact that your data has been compromised. Whether it's been exfiltrated or not is yet to be seen, but it has been compromised. It is part of a data breach.
The longer we go in this, the more concerned I become. And I'd like to switch back to Heng as a professor at this point, because What Brett was just talking about with regard to paying the ransom, there's a lot of people that there are the legal issues with it, but there are a lot of people who have moral concerns about whether or not you should pay an attacker. And it's beyond what Brett said for the obvious reasons you could end up funding terrorism. It's just, it doesn't seem right. Do you have any perspective on this? And, you know, what would you advise someone to do if they had to negotiate with a ransomware attacker, or do you just say no?
That's a tricky question. So whether you negotiate or not, I think Brad already indicated that every single business, they have their unique context to make this decision. And sometimes these decisions can be just a business decision, right? How quickly, how critical these data to you, do you really need to, what's the potential loss in terms of, you know, these attackers holding the threats that they may totally erase your data or destroy the infrastructure. So my advice would be, you know, looking into like two different perspectives. One is at each individual level, individual business level. The other is the collective market level. If everyone is rushing for negotiation and paying for that, and then we are actually facilitating a business market for these attackers. They know that, you know, they can easily manipulate two factors to all the business. One is fear, the fear of losing your market, losing your revenue, even losing your business, going bankrupt and so on. The other critical element they often manipulate is the time pressure, right? They say only days or even hours left, you know, before they destroying your critical assets. So they are trying to manipulating the fear and time. If all of us, all the business fall into that, and the market for, I mean, the dark market for these threats, for this blackmailing will be continuous growing, and collectively it's harder and harder for law enforcement to stop these attacks and stop these criminal behaviors. So I would think that think about this bigger picture, trying our best, right? To think about the collective goal about stopping these. And because that may affect, if we try to facilitate a market by negotiating, by paying them, and then these ransom attacks, I would say the frequency will be much more than we are seeing today.
I mean, everything you say makes a lot of sense, but I come back to a concern, and I'd like to get your opinion and then Brett's on it. This looks like we get to the lowest common denominator kind of problem. In my household, if I want to be protected, but if my child is on the computer and downloads something that looks kind of, you know, cartoonish, that we could get infected that way. If we're in a big organization, if anyone downloads something, it would seem that that could create a vulnerability. So even if we're installing the most up-to-date approaches, it would seem to validate what you said before, Heng, that we're all going to be in this forever. Any other ideas with regard to this? Because it just seems like we're stuck unless we want to unplug our computers and go back to, you know, paper and pencil.
Yeah, that's so I guess that's the reason why we're seeing this increasing numbers of attacks in the starting the year of the 2020. That's the year we started fighting the pandemic, where most of us started working from home. Okay, so when we work from home, the boundary, I'm talking about IT infrastructure wise, network wise, you know, data wise, right? We the boundary between the organization and your home environment starting blurring together. And sometimes, yeah, as you mentioned that, you know, my kids may utilizing my computer like just for browsing certain things, and just because of that there might be a, you know, the kids might you know, click on the malicious link and so on. That's maybe the starting point of attack. Yes, this all contributing to the high rise numbers of the cyber attacks we have been seeing. But I would say that, you know, basic awareness training, some basic cyber hygiene, such as American University is now pushing the two-factor authentication, right? Utilizing multiple factors to authenticate users who are accessing the either confidential data sets or the systems, right? We need multi-factor authentication, because just in case, one layer of the authentication was compromised, you have an extra layer as a protection. So as well as awareness training, right? And also some basic defense systems, such as, a lot of companies nowadays are using this sandboxing. Sandbox is a technological, defense layers where, for example, if you're using your mobile devices, your phone to access your organization's emails, but meanwhile also have other more, computer games installed for your kids to play, and you should use sandbox. I mean, the organization should have sandbox to isolate, create a virtual boundary between those business essential applications versus personal applications, in the case that if some compromise happening at these silly games, and then these unauthorized access won't affect the business essential application that within that sandbox. So I think these basic cyber hygiene, basic defense systems, and also the basic awareness of the cybersecurity education and training are all the essential steps.
And let me turn to Brett as well. I want to follow up on this with a slightly different, but maybe more specific question. It's, as people get compromised in these types of attacks, it appears that the type of ransom everyone asks for is always in some kind of cryptocurrency. And I wonder if that's the payment choice that criminals have in mind. Do you have any particular thoughts on ways that we could, get at that to solve this problem? Should we just, if we were to make all cryptocurrencies illegal, would that solve this problem?
Yeah, so I think we've heard that, right? We've heard that public discourse about banning cryptocurrency, banning ransomware payments. What I would say is there was similar conversation a decade ago when I was a newer agent working child exploitation cases, for example. Why don't we, could we ban Google because Google's being utilized to facilitate child pornography? Well, Google does a lot of good things, but it also does, it allows for some bad actors to manipulate it in bad ways. I would say the same is true of virtual currency. Virtual currency provides great technology. It provides it's promising in its future innovation and adoption, but it's also currently being utilized by bad actors 100% in these ransomware cases. There's no case where a ransomware actor is saying, hey, give us your debit card number so we can debit you, $5 million, right? Because after 9/11, the US government said we have to recognize how to disrupt foreign terrorist organizations from funding terrorism. We can't allow money to go to these FTOs to fund attacks on the United States. So the Patriot Act introduced know your customer laws. That's why when you go to any online or in-person bank, you have to disclose who your identity is, that you can't really open these accounts. And so without saying who you are, taking fingerprints, helping us have recourse should something go bad, should you send money to somebody you shouldn't. I think we're going to see maturity in the virtual currency market where we start to see some additional requirements put in place by US and European countries that are similar to know your customer laws, where if you want to get your virtual currency out, right? Because the asset itself, if you have 100 Bitcoin, it's worth nothing until you cash it out. And you have to go to an exchanger to do that. And these anonymous exchangers make it difficult right now because in Russia, in some of these, China, certainly Turkey, the Middle East, you can pull this money out and there's really no know your customer laws. So I think we're going to see some maturity there, I hope, where we're not going to do this blanket, ban cryptocurrency and, and ban ransomware payments necessarily, whereas we're going to see that maturation of the regulation. To go back a little bit to what Heng was talking about when it comes to what do we do going forward, she mentioned some really good techniques. So while it's true, no company is going to prevent 100% of the attacks. What we have to do is get to the point where we minimize what the impact is to the business, and we minimize what the impact is to our stakeholders. And Heng mentioned two-factor authentication. I've been doing that for the last 5 years on what is important to me, my fantasy football team. And so if I'm doing it on my fantasy football team, businesses should be doing that in their own, environments where they stand to lose hundreds of millions of dollars. So, concrete steps like that, de-escalation of privilege. How do we de-escalate privilege and what the employees have access to on the networks? How do we start to segment both physically and logically our network so that if one enclave is hit, the adversary can't traverse our network and hit other enclaves? If they get to our email, that's one thing, but if they get to our intellectual property, that's a whole different ballgame when it comes to ransomware compromise. The other thing I would say is we've done a very good job over the last 6 months from an FBI and a DHS standpoint at advertising that cyber risk is business risk. Cybersecurity is national security. This is no longer a game where CEOs and board members should rely on their IT professionals alone to manage risk to data and systems. This is an executive problem, and it's a board problem. Heng talked about a little bit about the training aspect and the awareness aspect, and that has to happen at the executive and the board level. These are the people who make risk management decisions for the organization. IT risk is so important in today's day and age. You can't relegate that to mid-level managers to make those decisions without any support or funding and expect your organization to stay resilient. So this has got to escalate to the boardroom, to the executives. We in the FBI are meeting with those board members, those executives on a regular basis, trying to say, we're the independent arbiters here. Like, make sure you're engaging your cybersecurity folks and you guys are understanding. You don't have to know the ones and zeros of cyber risk, but you do have to know the context and the risk to your business as well.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, Brett, just a little specific kind of follow-up. My understanding in the Colonial Pipeline situation was that some of the ransom was able to be captured in the virtual wallet that it got transferred to. Because there are so many different cryptocurrencies out there, is there a concern right now that everything will move towards the cryptocurrency that has the least ability for a government agency to find it?
Yes, and so using our unique criminal and national security authorities, that's why if you do decide to engage the bad actors and negotiate, and even if you are deciding to make a ransom payment, having law enforcement next to you when you're engaging in that dialogue is really important to our efforts to investigate and attribute that activity and maybe even recover some of your assets. Secondly, yes, the adversaries are saying, yeah, these more popular currencies like Bitcoin are increasingly under, the government has capability to intercept this. So they're going to move to some of the less traditional cryptocurrencies, Monero, which does self-tumbling and randomization on the blockchain. They're actually charging a 10 to 15% premium. If you want to pay them in Bitcoin, you now have to pay more than what you would if you're going to pay in a less traditional currency, just because they want to incentivize the difficulty in having law enforcement recover funds.
It sounds to me like you'll have a really interesting book to write at the end of your career, Brett. I want to switch gears a little bit as we've talked about this. And, you've given the timeline as to how this has developed. What's coming down the road? This has seemed to accelerate relatively quickly. And maybe, Heng, you could talk a little bit about what you see coming down the road with this kind, what the bad actors will do. And then maybe, Brett, you can follow on that because you'll have, I think, a slightly different perspective. But it makes me worry that it's not going to just be on our computer screens in the future. It's going to go way beyond that. So where's this going, Heng?
Sure. I see one trend and one fundamental thing is about the encryption. And as we all know that in the latest ransom attacks, the attackers all utilize the encryption techniques, right? They try to encrypt the data and then they will give you the decryption key until you pay for them. I would say that the future of technological advancement on quantum computing would be another question for us to think about it, right? And right now we see the attackers try to utilize encryption techniques for launching attacks. But on the other hand, to defend from the ransomware attacks, we also try to relax a little bit if we are, certain that our compromised data are already encrypted, right, by the business, and the attackers didn't get access to our decryption key. So which means that, what they got is just random noise that they can't figure out the meanings out of it. So we tend to be relaxed if we say that our business valuable assets and data are all encrypted. But think about the future when we have the quantum computing. If we are in the quantum computing era, and under those assumptions of our quantum computing environment, what we consider now as difficult task, right, in the classical computing environment would become very trivial task in a quantum computing environment. In other words, encryption algorithms the current generation of encryption algorithms are very easy to break when we reach to the era of quantum computing. So that's another huge challenge we all have to think about in the future.
Again, just seems to get worse and worse. What's your perspective on this, Brett? And then Iman's back, which means that we'll have questions from the audience too.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think we talked a little bit about the supply chain attack and the third-party risk. And I think as we increasingly have interconnected networks with our suppliers, with those we do business with, we may spend $1 million defending our networks. But if the mom and pop shop who has trusted access to our network does not engage in the same kind of defense, the adversary is going to attack them and come into our network. We've seen actors increasingly target those trusted third parties, the software-based supply chains. I think we're going to continue to see that as we continue to put devices, sensitive devices, whether it's IoT or industrial IoT on the IP space. Actors are going to start to target that. Actors want to prey on emotion. We talked about the time to get your data back. They try to prey on that. We see them targeting companies on holiday weekends when folks aren't around. The other thing we see is if the data is so critical that it needs to come back immediately to the organization, it could be a health and safety issue like a pacemaker. It could be something in the hospital system that if it's encrypted, we need to pay for it quickly because it has real world consequences. Just earlier this year, for example, we saw a Florida-based law enforcement agency that was fully encrypted, had their investigative documents encrypted, and it resulted in the dismissal of indictments against about a dozen drug dealers. That shows what kind of implications, the real-world implications ransomware is having. We're going to continue to see these sensitive networks and devices connected to the IP space, which means we're going to continue to see the actors targeting those, which means we have to continue to have these kind of dialogues so folks are aware and they can start taking measures now to better protect that data in those networks.
And I think from the IoT perspective, what you're saying is that the potential vulnerabilities will increase dramatically just because more devices are going to be connected. And from what I've seen, some of the connected devices don't necessarily have the best security right now. My refrigerator, for example. And, I don't know, before the Super Bowl, could they make my beer warm?
That would be a tragedy, in my opinion. The other thing I would say to that point is some of these components are manufactured in foreign countries that are with very cheap hardware and software on board that are either not capable of updating appropriately or have hard-coded access by which the manufacturer can get back into the device to update it. But if it's manufactured in a communist country, it also gives that those state-sponsored organizations access to those systems as well.
Wow, that's a lot to think about. Let me turn it to Ayman though, because I know that you've got some questions from the audience, and then we'll come back because we do have some questions about guidance that we'd like Brett and Heng to give to students as they're looking at their careers. But Ayman, why don't you raise some of the questions now, please?
Thanks, John, and thank you so much, Brett and Heng, for a very timely and a timeless discussion. I was having the same reactions as John was having just listening to the conversation. I think I reset my passwords at least 5 times during this past hour, just of listening to some of the risks. But all joking aside, one of the things that Heng had referred to was the 2-factor authentication and identification that folks have been pursuing now, especially organizations like AU and others. On an individual level, on a personal level, whether it's a student, a staff member, a faculty member, what else can we do to protect our own information and everything that's important to us? And a similar related question is for small businesses in the protection phase, protection or deterrence phase. What are the top 1 or 2 things that they can do? So both on the individual, but also on a small business prior to an attack or trying to prevent or deter an attack.
So I will go first since we mentioned about AU context. So I would urge faculty students to adopt a 2-factor identification by the specified deadline, which is the end. It's October 28th. So do this as soon as possible. And in addition to that, for students, I think do regular backup of your data. Okay, so not mentioning about ransom attack, just in case that you lost your devices or there are some damage of your devices, you still have your critical data access, such as your homework, your projects. So that's the one advice to students. To small business, I think data backup is also critically important, just in case that you lose this critical access, you still have a copy somewhere so that you can recover your business as soon as possible. And then second, for the small business, I think data encryption for your valuable data sets, encrypt the data. So just in case that, you had ransom attacks, but even, that happened, but you're pretty certain that your data has been encrypted, that can reduce your loss to some extent. So backup and encryption, and do encryption before, quantum computing breaks it. I think I still believe encryption before the quantum computing finally breaks it. So Brett, do you have?
Yeah, and one thing I would say on the backups is also air gap those backups, because what we've seen is these actors in the more sophisticated ransomware variants will also look for backups before they encrypt your systems, and they'll encrypt your backups as well. So air gap those backups, which means air gap means disconnect them from the production systems. Have backups from a month ago separated, encrypted, so that if push comes to shove, you have older backups. It's not ideal, but you can reconstitute from, and then you can do more weekly backups that are connected a little more often, but really look at disconnecting that stuff. I would also say if you're a small to medium business, you probably don't have a dedicated IT staff to defend your data and your systems. And so I think there is real utility in analyzing some of the large cloud-based platforms out there, whether it's, we don't recommend any products, but whether it's Office 365, whether it's AWS, whether it's Azure, whether it's any of these cloud platforms, Microsoft, Amazon Web Services, they certainly have an entire team of security professionals looking at the perimeter of their data centers. And there's an opportunity to leverage multi-factor authentication, their threat intelligence, by just outsourcing some of your work to cloud-based platforms. Even free email, Gmail, is many times more secure than hosting your own, because you get free multi-factor authentication with that. So while I can't tell you, go to Gmail or, Microsoft products, do your own due diligence and research and say, can I leverage cloud-based platforms? Same with your financial account and your accounting software. They're increasingly going to the cloud, and they offer free multi-factor or 2-factor authentication on many of those applications.
Thank you. One of the things that you mentioned, Brett, during the discussion on trends was the potential risks moving forward from trusted third parties. So how can organizations now move to, one, identify the most risky third-party providers and deal with that? Is that part of the contract itself in terms of what systems they should have in place? Is it a random audit that's being done? Or what are some thoughts in terms of trying to deal with the third-party risk?
Well, you hit two of them. SLAs or service level agreements and contracts make sure that there's a clear understanding about what you expect from your third parties and how you can enforce that with those third parties through potential audits. You want to understand, like if you're housing our data in your environment, I want to be able to come to that environment. If I have a dedicated server there, I want to be able to for example, look at log files associated with that to see what kind of access folks have to my data in your environment. If you're connecting to my environment, I want to ensure that you're enforcing multi-factor authentication, that you have a patch management program in your organization, that your folks that are connected to my systems are not going to be using software that's 2 years out of date. That you are getting certain threat intelligence, that you guys are receiving intelligence from the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency and the FBI, and you're reacting to some of those vulnerabilities in your network. We want to see what your patch management program looks like. So being able to have those service level agreements, those contracts, being able to audit them is important. The other thing I would say is many organizations that have third parties connecting to them may have more resources than those third parties have, and don't just leave those third parties to their own devices to try to come up with ways to protect themselves. Partner with them. Your livelihood depends on them. Certainly society's livelihood depends on you and them. Our economy, our national security depends on you guys defending. So partner with those third parties. And if they are deficient in some areas, share your knowledge and help them come to a place of better understanding.
Thank you. And one more question is there a difference now in physical presence of organizations as they expand overseas or go to other countries? Does it make a difference which country they're based in? Is that a high risk, or regardless of where you are, that risk could be the same anywhere in the world?
From my perspective, you have risk. Whenever you go overseas, you have risk. I mean, if you're going to Europe, you have GDPR, you have to worry about for data breach protections. You have to understand the legal ramifications, the regulatory ramifications. That's less in my wheelhouse than the risk of moving to higher threat foreign countries like China, Russia, or those regions where they have access. What I would say is if you're in a country that has, or you operate in a country that has SORM laws, Russia has SORM, FSB can intercept any data that transits the country of Russia, absent any real legal process or notification to the victim company that is being intercepted. Here in the US, we have to get legal process. We have to go before a judge. We have to seek appropriate authorities to do that. That is not the case in China. That is not the case in Russia. It's not the case in many of these countries. So understand the laws of the country that you're in, and understand that even if you're a US-based company, but you have infrastructure that transits those countries, it's subject to those countries' laws, in that you have a real vulnerability there. Now, increasingly, companies have a presence in China. And what I would say is we see a real move by the PRC to examine vulnerabilities within those companies that sit in China. If you have travelers going to or from China, they are certainly vulnerable to exploitation by the PRC, and that is probably the country that does the most business with the U.S. here. Certainly, there are vulnerabilities in academia with sharing academic resources, whether it's personnel or online platforms. So I think as you move to those high-risk countries, you have to really be cognizant of what those risks are.
Thank you. And John, I know you wanted to ask a question, so I'll defer to you because I know we're running out of time.
But as we close out, I mean, I'm frightened by many of the things we talked about. I wonder if we could turn this around, and Heng and Brett, you might be able to give a little guidance to students on what kind of opportunities for their careers might emerge from this area that seems so dark.
So thank you. Thank you, John. I think we're talking about, I'm a business professor, so I would encourage business students to try the promising field of cybersecurity. And don't just think about cybersecurity is a field with, all these technological central, trainings or foundations. It's not just defense and attacks. It's also about training. It's also about human factors. It's also about business risk management. So I think I would think that we desperately need business students to come and join this cyber related field so that we can make it better. We can make the CEOs and executives all realize that cyber risk is real business risk. They have to take serious action on it. And we probably also need the skills from our marketing students, how to better make those training materials more fun, more engaging, applying what we have learning about persuasion in marketing and apply these to design the next generation entertaining cyber training so that people won't fall asleep in those cyber training sessions. So that's just from me.
Thank you, Heng. Brett.
Yeah, I agree 100% with what Hans said. And what I would add is that this seems really depressing. And unfortunately, when the Bureau talks, when the FBI talks, we come with a kind of a jaded message. What I would say is my perspective is both a prior private sector cyber guy and a Bureau cyber guy, is that we can really make traction on this problem by embracing existing tools and frameworks that are in place. We see way too little reliance on free tools available via NIST, for example. The National Institute on Standards and Technology, they put out guidance for government networks on the cybersecurity framework, developing an incident response plan, a ransomware response plan, that are free resources for businesses, and they just don't know about it. So leveraging NIST to develop some governance and some frameworks and some incident response plans, using really industry recognized frameworks is important, and folks should be doing that. Basic cybersecurity hygiene, some of which we talked about today, will not prevent 100% of ransomware attacks, but it's going to reduce your need to probably pay a ransom, or reduce the impact to your organization of the number of systems that are impacted overall. And then really helping risk managers and boards of directors and business professionals to come together to start to address this problem. We're never gonna win the fight when it comes to prevention, but we're gonna win the fight when it comes to the need to pay the kind of ransom payments that we are today. If we just start to leverage some of the free tools out there, start to implement some of the baseline protections, and start to really embrace cyber risk as business risk. For new students, I would agree with Heng 100% that even if you're a business student or a marketing student, look for ways to better understand. You don't have to understand the technical side. You don't have to be an incident responder. But if you understand risk and governance, it's going to make you a better employee, a more marketable employee someday. And you're really going to have a depth of knowledge that a lot of folks don't have today. So really exposing yourself to that is really important.
Wonderful advice. And I want to be respectful of everyone's time and conclude by saying thank you to Brett Leatherman and Heng Su for being here today. We appreciate all the guidance and advice, and we could probably talk for 4 hours about this. What I'd say to our students is the negatives in this suggest there's tremendous opportunities if you get the skill sets that allow you to serve law enforcement or government or private industry to help thwart these types of problems. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending the webinar, and Ayman and Jim, thank you as well, and we will say goodbye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.